In the name of Jesus, my dear friends, Lois Tverberg, as she co-authored a book with Ray Vander Laan called Walking in the Dust of Rabbi Jesus, tells a story about a recent trip she had taken to Israel. She and her friends were talking, getting ready to go to the marketplace, about how they had to kind of get their heart and mind ready to do their best haggling when they got to the street with all the stores at the open market, so that they could get the best bargain prices possible for the souvenirs they wanted to bring back home. Well, their guide overheard their conversation, and he gently reminded them that in recent years it had been really terrible on the merchants because of political events that have happened in Palestine. Tourists have been kept away for months from their stores, and many of them were barely keeping their stores open. And she wrote in her book, responding to what their guide had said, a few shekels difference was a source of pride at how cheaply we could get a souvenir. For the shop owners, as our guide reminded us, what we would end up paying was how they were going to feed their families for another day. She goes on to say there's a difference between being frugal and being stingy. A frugal person is someone who's willing to deny themselves something they'd like to have in order to save some money. Being stingy, on the other hand, is not denying ourselves, it's denying other people what their due is for what we're purchasing by underpaying them, selfishly trying to save ourselves some money at their expense. Well, being stingy is a good example of what the Hebrew idiom means to have a bad or an evil eye. Because that idiom literally means to be miserly, greedy, or self-centered and blind to the needs of other people. It's kind of like looking in a mirror, all you see is yourself. And even if we don't intend to be there, it's where we quickly go when we begin living life out of the attitude about what's in it for me. You have to give me what I want because this is what I want. This is what I demand. So if I go and protest, if I write letters to the editor or to their governor, it's all about me. So you've got to give me what we want because only I know what's right for me. But God teaches us it's not about what's in it for me. But Jesus teaches us that our love for God is most clearly demonstrated for our love for each other and how we care for and serve one another. And so we're not called to live with a life with the attitude of what's in it for me, but rather, Lord, how can I bless other people? How can I care for other people in your name? St. Paul, in his letter to the Philippians, echoes the words of Jesus in our gospel reading this morning in Matthew chapter 6. In his letter to the Philippians chapter 2, he says this, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Each of you should look not only to your own interests, but to the interests of others. And then he uses the example of Jesus. This is how God treats us. He's not sitting in his heaven going, what's in it for me? He's going, here's the need of the people I created. He sends his one only son, Jesus, to take up our humanity, to pay the wage of our sin by giving his life in death on a cross and then rising again in victory for us. So as Jesus teaches on his Sermon on the Mount here in the first chapters of Matthew, he says this, he says, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. Instead, he says, lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moth and rust do not decay and destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. And then he says, for where your treasure is, that's where your heart will be also. The things that we treasure, the things that we deem valuable and important to us are matters of the heart. So it's not any surprise, I think, that Jesus ties our treasures, which is more than just money, to what's our heart. Because here, understand this, if there's an activity that we treasure, that we enjoy doing, that we love doing, don't we make room in our schedules to go do that, even if we have to cancel other things? If I love to go hunting for deer hunting season, we get to that opening day in November, and it doesn't matter what we call in sick. We do whatever we got to do to be able to be up in the North Woods hunting. Where treasure is, that's where your heart will be also, Jesus says. And how we treat other people, how we utilize what God has placed into our hands, the abilities God has given to us, the education, the knowledge He's poured into us, and the material wealth that He's given to us. How we use those to serve others reveals a great deal about our attitude towards God and what we believe about God Himself. For example, if we believe that life is all about me, if I'm practically living my life asking the question, what's in it for me? Because I got to look out for number one. What we're implying then ultimately about God is that God Himself is stingy and greedy and miserly, and that He's either unwilling or unable to take care of us, which hence means we've got to look out for number one because nobody else will. We've got to be always asking the question, what's in it for me? Because if I don't get something for me, nobody else will. On the other hand, if I'm convinced that when I was brought into God's family, whether that was by hearing the gospel and making a profession of faith or being baptized, that God said He's come to live and abide with me, that God's caring presence is always with me. If I'm convinced that that's true, and it is according to the scriptures, if I'm confident that what God has promised He will do, that He was able to do far more abundantly than all I can ask or imagine, will abundantly take care of me, when I believe and convince God is a generous God who loves and cares about me and will take care of me, then even if I'm not wealthy by earthly standards, my confidence is I'll have enough. What I need will be sufficient from God's hand. And that what God has entrusted into my hands is meant not to be all for me, but a portion of that, at the very least, is meant to be shared with others in their time of need. And all of it, not just a portion of it, is to be used and distributed and accessed all to the glory of God. As Jesus teaches us in our gospel lesson in Matthew 6 again, He's showing us a way using this Hebrew idiom of bad eye and good eye, how to make that transition. He says that the difference is by doing what we're doing to lay up treasures for ourselves in heaven. And that happens when we live a life that looks beyond ourselves into the needs of others, that utilizes what God has placed in our hands and use it to bless others and to take care of others. And so in talking about laying up for ourselves treasures in heaven, Jesus goes on in our gospel reading this morning and says, your eye is a lamp that provides light for the body. When your eye is good, your whole body is filled with light. And initially what Jesus is sharing here in his Sermon on the Mount seems to have changed subjects right in the middle, and you go, light, what? I thought we were talking about this, and now we're talking about that. But when you understand what Jesus is using was a commonly understood and known Hebrew idiom, a good eye, like an evil or a bad eye, a good eye that means to be generous. Now this whole section of our gospel reading kind of pulls all together. And we use idioms all the time. We don't usually call them that, but let me give you a couple examples. If I said someone's kicked the bucket, what does it mean? They died, right? You tell that to somebody who's learning English for the first time, and they're going, what? Why would somebody kick the bucket? Or if you say to someone who's going up on stage to perform, you say, break a leg. And again, the foreigner learning English for the first time say, what in the world? Why would you want somebody to break their leg on stage? Here's another one. If we say someone has got your goat, what do we mean? They got under your skin, they've irritated you, they've bothered you, maybe you've become angry. Here's another one. If we tell somebody to quit beating around the bush, do we really believe that they've taken a stick and they're walking around some bush in circles and hitting it? No, we're saying get to the point. Tell us what you want. Well, the Hebrew language has idioms just like we do in English, and this good eye, or in Hebrew, ayin tova, is one of those. And it's used elsewhere in scriptures, not just here in our gospel reading this morning. For example, in Proverbs 28:22, it says, the stingy are eager to get rich and are unaware that poverty awaits them. And the word stingy in English, literally in the Hebrew, is a bad eye. In Proverbs 22:9, it says, whoever has a bountiful or a beautiful eye, that is a good eye, is generous and will be blessed, for he shares his bread with the poor. Even as Jesus told a parable in the Gospel of Matthew in the 20th chapter, he tells this parable about a farmer who needs help to bring his harvest in. And so he goes to the center of town where those that are looking for work are to be hired. And he goes at the first hour of the day and he says, if you'll come and work for me in my harvest field all day, I'll pay you a fair day's wage. And they agreed, and off they go. He comes back a couple hours later, says, I still need some more. But listen, if you come and work for me, even though we're into the day, I'll still pay you a whole day's wage. He keeps doing that throughout the day till finally he's getting near the harvest, but he needs a couple more guys to get the job done. So he comes back to the marketplace and he says to some still waiting around, if you'll come and work for me this last hour or two, I'll still pay you a whole day's wage. The end of the day comes and the laborers line up. And the farmer pays them from those who worked the least amount of time to those who have been there the whole day. And when those who have been there the whole day saw that the farmer was paying those that worked only an hour to a whole day's wage, when they got to their turn, they expected they'd get paid more than what they agreed to, because they said, well, I've worked that much harder. I deserve more. And this is what the farmer says. Jesus tells the parable. He says, don't I have a right to do with what I want with my own money? Or is your eye bad because I am generous? Even today in Israel, that term, a good eye, is still in use. If somebody from a local charity came up to your door and knocked on your door in Israel and asked you to make a donation to their charity, they would end what they're asking you by saying this. They'd say, please, would you give with a good or a beautiful eye? They still understand what that means. Be generous. So the point that Jesus is making here in his Sermon on the Mount of what it means to lay up treasures for ourselves in heaven is to live the life of generosity in contrast to being generous. Generosity makes a deposit in heaven. Stinginess lays up treasures on earth that rust and decay and are lost and destroyed. When Jesus is teaching here about living with a good eye, this Hebrew idiom, he's teaching us that generosity needs to be generosity to the needy is something that is part of kingdom living. It's the expression of the love and grace and mercy of God lived out in practical terms. Now, in the oral law, if you go back to the Old Testament, having a good eye meant that you left a minimum portion of your fields at times of harvest for the poor to glean. And they literally had percentages of this. So if you left the corners and usually it's the corners of your field, and if you left about roughly 3%, little or so, of your corners of your whole harvest, they call that you're having a good eye, you're a generous person. But if you, as a son of Israel, left only 1% or less of your corners of your field, you were said to have had a bad eye. You were stingy and greedy. You weren't being generous with the people of need. Generosity, Jesus says, is the very opposite of being selfish and consumed about what's in it for me. Even if you look through the lens of the pictographic meaning of this word, a good eye, in Hebrew, ayin tova, what you get is a rough translation of this way. The meaning of that phrase is this: I will make the generosity of my goodness, my habitation. Let me say that again. I'll make the generosity of my goodness my habitation. A little more plainly in English, I will make generosity my way of life. That's what ayin tova, having a good eye, means. There's a Jewish saying that's been around a very long time that says, whoever has a good eye, a humble spirit, and a modest soul is a disciple of Abraham, our father, who enjoys this world and inherits the world to come. The state of our eye, good or bad, depends on how generous we are to people. And to have a good eye, to be a generous person, is not simply to have or perform an act of generosity. It is to live a life, to make generosity our habitation, the way of our living in our life. As Jesus concludes our gospel reading this morning, as he's teaching about how to live generously, how to live with a good eye, he says, no one can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You can't serve both God and money. Generosity, understand this. Generosity is one of the great keys of God's kingdom living. There's another Hebrew word, tzedakah, which means charity, righteousness, it's translated into English. That the very act of right living, of loving God, is expressed in our actions to those who are in need. And when we look and care for the poor and those in need around us, whether it's a family member or someone else, makes no difference. In the gospel of God's grace, we are called to live a life of generosity, just as God has been generous to us with open-handedness, not withholding any good thing from us. You see that lived out in Acts chapter 2. The early believers, after Jesus ascends into heaven, we're told in Acts chapter 2 that all the believers were together and had everything in common, and they gave to anyone who had need. They took their excess and sold it, and they held it in common together as the people of God, so that anyone who had need could be supplied. Widows, orphans, someone unemployed. One of the things that we do here at Holy Cross that is a real blessing too is it's called the Pastor's Discretionary Aid Fund, and that's something that you entrust into the hands of your pastor, that as needs are seen on behalf of all of you, we can meet those needs to the best of our ability. So besides our everyday ministry of the gospel, that's one of those practical ways. And as God richly blesses you and you have more than you need, and you're thinking, what could I do with this to honor God? That's one place that you could invest yourself in that abundance. The other is to use the gifts and abilities that God has already given to you. Use the passions and graces God has already given to you as a way to bless other people. That's another way to live with a good eye, to be a generous person, not using it just for yourself, but to share what you know and what you can do with other people. When we read the Bible, especially the Old Testament, we're usually pretty happy to skip past all the Old Testament legal codes. All the do's and the don'ts that are in there, one thing after another, and you wonder, how did people in the Old Testament ever live up to all of that? But would it shock you to realize that even there in the Old Testament, that God commanded, he didn't suggest, he commanded that when someone gave a loan to someone in need, you couldn't charge any interest. No revolving credit accounts. No department store, Best Buy, or any of those places that offer your own credit card. You want to buy a bed on creditors, and you're paying 19, 20, 30%. No. God commanded no interest on loans. You are there to help the needy. In fact, if that loan could not or hadn't been paid in 7 years, God commanded that you literally wrote it off and forgave it. What's more is that even slaves and animals, God commanded that they were to be given a day of rest, just like the master was, in accordance with the pattern that God set up in working 6 days in creation and resting on the seventh. And so by that, God was saying that even to the slave and to the animal, those that you used to earn a living for yourself, they were on equal station with you as the master of the house. And even if a person fell in hard times and they sold their land in order to pay their bills, it'd be a pretty desperate time, especially if you're a farmer. But in Israel, does it surprise you that in the 50th year, every 50th year, it's called the year of Jubilee? Even if you bought the land from somebody, you had to give it back to them or to their descendants. That's the generosity of God. God trying to teach his people to be generous. You're saying, wait a second, I'm absorbing the cost. Generosity is giving of self for the benefit of others, just the way that God does for us through his son, Jesus Christ. Even in the Old Testament, God tied our relationship with him and our worship of him to our compassion for others. Charity to those in need. And it calls us to live our lives simply enough so that we have capacity enough to set aside a portion of who we are and what we have in order to be a blessing to other people. Generosity, friends, is not just about money. It's also about acts of loving kindness, visiting the sick, comforting those who mourn, investing in others out of the overflow of your gifts and abilities. That's ayin tova. That's a good eye. That's what it means to be generous. That's what Jesus is teaching us about, and it's something that we need to all take to heart, because that's what God calls every believer to. In Jesus' name, amen.